Hey, welcome back to 65 Drums. My name's Justin. Today we're taking a look at the very best electronic drums for roughly $3,000. Right now, that means the Yamaha DTX-8K, the Roland V8307, the F-Note 3X and 5, and finally the ATV Edrum's Artist Standard Edition. I will be touching a little bit on the TD27 KV because it costs $3,000, but not that much. It'll be more of like a sidebar comparison because it's no longer being produced. And the new version costs $3,500, so it's out of the price range that I really want to focus on in this video comparison. I had to draw a line somewhere. There was a point where I was going to have to compare, 10 different drum sets, and that was just too much. But first, today's video is brought to you by EdrumCenter.com. If you're in the market for a new or used electronic drum set, use the link down in the description below to save $25 off your next order of over $100. Now the good news is, when you spend $3,000, there are no bad electronic drums. It's kind of like spending $500 on an acoustic ride cymbal. It doesn't matter which brand you buy, it's going to be good. But because we're not quite in flagship territory here, the drum sets still have to have a focus on what they really want to spend most of their budget on. Okay, so let's move ahead to category number 1, drum and cymbal sizes. These drum sets come in two basic types. You have the pad-based drums, and then you have the more acoustic-like drums. Now, starting with the Yamaha DTX-8K, you get a 7.5-inch kick drum tower, the snare drum is 12 inches across, the toms are 10, 10, and 10 inches across, the crashes and the hi-hats are all 13 inches across, and the ride cymbal is 15 inches across. Moving over to the Roland V8307, you get an 18-inch kick drum, a 12-inch snare, the toms are 10, 10, and 12 inches across, the crashes and the hi-hats are all 12 inches across, and the ride cymbal is 14 inches across. So between these two drum sets, basically Roland gives you the bigger drums and Yamaha gives you slightly bigger cymbals. Moving over to F-Note, this company has basically got two drum sets at the same price that are catered towards different kinds of drummers. The F-Note 3X comes in with a 12-inch kick drum, a 12-inch snare drum, and 4 toms. Half of them are 10-inch, half of them are 12-inch. You get two 16-inch crashes, which are huge on a drum set like this. You get a 14-inch two-piece set of hi-hats, and the ride cymbal is 18 inches across. Moving over to the F-Note 5, this is the more acoustic-like one. You get a 16x12 kick drum, a 12x5 snare drum, tom 1 is 10x7, and tom 2 is 12x12. Crash 1 is 16 inches across, and the second cymbal is a splash cymbal that is 8 inches across. The hi-hats are identical to the previous set, you get a 14-inch two-piece set, and the ride cymbal is also the same at 18 inches across. Now moving over to ATV, you get an 18x12 kick drum, the snare is 13x5.5, tom 1 is 10x6.5, and tom 2 is 13x12. The first crash is 16 inches across, and crash 2 is not on this drum set. The hi-hats are a two-piece 14-inch set, and the ride cymbal is 18 inches across. Now moving ahead to category number 2, we have drum head materials. With one exception, all these drum sets are basically 2-ply mesh drum sets, so they all have a very similar vibe while playing on them. But there are slight variations in feel because they are still different companies and maybe the mesh materials are slightly different across the different brands. Now the one big exception here is that the Yamaha drum set gives you two different choices for drum heads. You can either buy the mesh or you can buy the silicone version. They call them TCS pads. It's basically an evolved version of a rubber pad. It's hard to explain unless you actually play on them. Some people prefer this to mesh, other people like mesh more. It depends on the person. The disadvantage is that the whole drum set ends up weighing more, and secondly, the price tag does go up by, I believe, $500 if you buy the TCS version. The next category is cross-stick sensors. Unfortunately, the DTX-8K and the V8307 are too stupid to know when you're trying to play a rim shot versus a rim click. To get around this, you have to press a button on the module, which I feel like is just a weird way of going about it in this day and age, especially at this price range. Meanwhile, the F-Note 3X and 5 have a secondary rim that you play on to do cross-stick. There's actually a sensor inside of it. You have to plug a second cable into that versus the regular snare, and that way it's always correctly knowing when you're trying to play cross-stick versus rim shot. Meanwhile, ATV has a clever workaround other than this. They do have the secondary raised wood rim, but there is no cable involved. The module just sees the incoming waveforms from you playing the drum, and it can differentiate when you're hitting that secondary piece of wood, and so it automatically generates a cross-stick sound. The next category is positional sensing. So this is when you can hit multiple parts of a drum and it will generate a different tone. So on the Yamaha DTX-8K, you get it on the ride cymbal, which isn't a big deal because it's honestly a very small ride cymbal, but it's nice to have as a feature. And you also get positional sensing on the snare drum, but only if you buy the TCS version of the drum set that's more expensive. The next category is 360 triggering of the cymbals. So this is when you can play and choke the edge of the entire cymbal. Roland and Yamaha, they only really design their cymbals so you can play on the front half. Now, of course, you can play in the bow area of the back half of their cymbals, but you won't get an edge hit or be able to choke the cymbals on the back half. To combat this, they have anti-rotation stoppers, so they relatively stay in the same place. Okay, so those are the drum sets for roughly $3,000. But now let's compare them against a drum set that's on the way out, the Roland TD27 KV. Again, this is just the pads, not the module. We'll talk about that in the second part of the video. The main advantage is that it has the best ride cymbal and the best snare drum out of all the drum sets on the list. On the ride cymbal side, the gap isn't massive, but it is a little bit better than the ATV and F-note ride cymbals in my opinion. Meanwhile, the snare drum is actually significantly better in my opinion. Not only is it larger than all the other snare drums, it's the only one that's 14 inches across, it's also got the ability to detect different kinds of rim shots, very in-depth positional sensing, and cross stick. The main downside of this drum set is the sizes of the rest of the drum pads and overall aesthetics. The kick drum is not doing this drum set any favors, it just doesn't look quite as cool from a distance compared to something like an F-Note 5 or the ATV drum set. Also, if you compare it against the Roland VAD307, that drum set has the larger kick drum, it has the larger floor tom, and overall, aesthetically, it just looks nicer. Taking that all into consideration though, I still think the TD27 KV has the stronger set of pads. Okay, so now let's move ahead to part 2 of the video, comparing the drum modules. By the way, you'll see that there are 2 F-Note and ATV modules in the comparison. This is because the ATV drum set can be configured with the flagship 85, the cheaper XT3, or without a module in the first place. Meanwhile, there's 2 F-Note modules that have the exact same shell, connectors, and screen, and even the same editing. But they decided to make the kits and sound set ever so slightly different. Okay, so on to the comparison. By the way, Edrum companies are kind of notorious for not always listing basic module specs, which means I had to dig through a lot of PDFs with a calculator to come up with some of the non-official numbers that you'll see on screen. Anything that I gloss over will be clarified in the pile of asterisks below. When it comes to preset kits, the Roland TD17 takes the lead with 70 built in, plus access to more via the Roland Cloud. Meanwhile, the Yamaha DTX Pro has the most built-in sounds with roughly 563. Details on how I got that number below. Sound editing is a tricky one to cover because both the DTX Pro and TD17 have some editing features the other one doesn't have, but I think the TD17 wins this round. It kind of depends on what you want the module to be able to do. Meanwhile, F-Note and ATV don't even really try to be the best of this category. F-Note only offers the basic editing options, and ATV doesn't offer any. Moving forward to which module can handle the most drums and cymbals plugged in, that's a tie between Yamaha and F-Note. The DTX Pro actually gets a boost because of the extra input that comes on the kick drum, bumping it up to parity with F-Note. But F-Note does win the next round, which is total outputs, basically because their modules can do 8 channels of audio over USB. The sample import category swings back in Yamaha's favor, because they have a limited version of multi-layer sample import. Next up is Bluetooth, which really shouldn't be its own category, it just should be this like basic universal feature, but it's not. Roland and F-Note have it, ATV and Yamaha do not. Roland and F-Note tie once again when it comes to MIDI because they have the most options. Having Bluetooth allows them to do Bluetooth MIDI. The next category is third-party pad compatibility. Here the ATV 85 takes its one and only W. Just look at this giant list of pads and cymbals that it works with. I'd say the DTX Pro probably comes in last place for this particular category due to the way they wire their cymbals and hi-hat controller, among other things that I might cover in a different video. Next up is sound tone, character, and style. If you like really organic and natural sounding kits that don't have much processing done to them, F-Note and ATV really excel in this area. Meanwhile, if you want a larger variety of sounds, including some kits that fit really well with heavier genres of music, the TD17 and DTX Pro are just better at that. So that being said, now let's bring up the TD27 and see how it stacks up. By the way, this is assuming that you buy TD27 KV while it's still $3,000 before they run out of stock. So it turns out the TD27 mops the floor with most of the categories. This module has the most sounds, the most preset kits, the deepest sound editing, the most pad inputs, support for cable splitters, the most outputs, It's the only module with 5-pin MIDI in, and it also is the only module with a foot switch. This is so you can have that virtual hi-hat drop clutch on the ground or change kits with your feet. This drum module does a lot of things right. It's not perfect though. I do hate how lightweight and plasticky it feels in the hand. Not that I'm afraid I'm going to break it, it just doesn't feel quite as premium as ATV or even the Yamaha DTX Pro. And while the sounds are very detailed and very crisp, they still have that distinct edge of processing. On the other hand though, some people are very good at pulling some great sounding kits out of this module. Check out some videos done by either the Edrum Workshop or V-Expressions to see what I mean. Okay, so that wraps up the drum modules. Now let's move ahead to the third and final part of the video where we compare just the drum sets as a complete package. It's all well and good to wade through an ocean of different specs. We could talk about this all day, but really it comes down to what do the drum sets amount to as a complete overall kit. When it comes to the Yamaha DTX 8K, this drum set is great if you sit down and play it. A lot of people just see some photos of it, they see that it's a small drum set, and they don't want to buy it. And I understand, that's where the average electronic drummer is going. But if you sit down and play it, it is a nice, high-quality drum set that's just a little bit on the small side. It has two main strengths. It's got a very strong drum module that's better than most of the other ones on the list. I think only the TD27 really gives it a run for its money. And secondly, it's the only kit that gives you a secondary drum head option. Not everybody likes mesh heads. I do, most people do, but some people want an alternative, and this is the only company giving you a secondary drum head material choice. Also, it's nice that it gives you two different kinds of finishes. Now, when it comes to weaknesses, the main concern most people have are the size of the drums. It has the overall smallest shells at this price. Even the Roland drum set at least gives you the larger floor tom and a much larger and heavier kick drum. Because of those smaller sizes, just like the Roland drum set, I feel like both of those kits are overpriced by at least a couple $100. Another downside is that the cymbals feel a little bit small and stale. They're not trying to make them thinner, more flexible. They're not trying to make them lighter. They're not trying to give them any sort of cool technology under the hood. They don't have 360 triggering. They're just very, very basic. And finally, there is no dedicated side stick sensor for people that like to play cross stick. Instead, you have to press a mode switch button, or maybe there's a virtual threshold crossover point. Now let's move ahead to the Roland VAD307. It doesn't really come across as the best drum set at any individual category, but it's kind of just good at most things. It doesn't have the best module at this price, but it doesn't have the worst module. It doesn't have the best cymbals, but it doesn't have the worst cymbals. It doesn't have the biggest drums, but it doesn't have the smallest drums. If you're a Roland fan and you just want something that works and looks kind of cool, this drum set does the job, and I like this over the Yamaha DTX 8K. When it comes to downsides of the Roland VD307, well, it does have the smallest cymbal set out of the entire list. At $3,000, the ride cymbal has to be bigger than 14 inches across. It just makes no sense. Also, yet again, it doesn't have a dedicated side stick sensor, while the TD27 does, the F-Note ones do, and the ATV drum set does as well. So as a whole, it's an all-rounder, good drum set that does the job, but it's not necessarily the best at any single category. But if I personally had to choose between this and a Roland TD27 KV, I would take the TD27 KV every single time because of the vastly superior drum module, snare drum, and ride cymbal. Next up are the two F-Note drum sets. The really interesting thing is that they're offering two kits at the exact same price in different form factors. The F-Note 3X is especially interesting to me because it essentially has the pad set of a Roland TD30 KV, but with a slightly smaller kick drum and way bigger cymbals. F-Note gives you a fantastic set of cymbals on both of their drum sets. The hi-hats especially are really, really good. It basically has the next generation version of the optical sensor inside of the ATV hi-hats. But of course, no company is perfect. When it comes to downsides of the F-Note kits, the ATV Edrum set is slightly larger than the F-Note 5. And while the F-Note 3X definitely has a better set of drums and cymbals versus the DTX 8K or the Roland VAD307, the module definitely is more limited, has fewer sounds, and less editing features. And the F-Note hi-hats, while they're awesome, they do tie you down to the F-Note ecosystem because they don't use 1/4-inch cables like everybody else. Instead, what they do is send power and signal over one multi-pin wire. So because of this, if you want to upgrade the module of the F-Note drum set to something like a Pearl Mimic Pro or a 2-Boxer MIC5 Model 2 or something like that, the only way I can think of to make this happen is to go from the MIDI out of your F-Note module into the MIDI in of your new module. The reason why this isn't ideal is that most people, if they want to get a newer and better module, they'll sell their current lower end module and then use that money to finance the next module. Instead, you'll have to keep around the F-Note module in order to power the next module. And then finally, we have the ATV Edrum's drum set. As you can tell, this looks very similar to the F-Note 5, and it has some advantages and disadvantages when you do that sort of comparison. So for example, the ATV drum set, on the plus side, it'll work with whatever module that you throw at it. Apparently a lot of people will bundle this with a Pearl Mimic Pro. Also, the shell sizes are a little bit larger. So you get an 18-inch kick drum instead of the 16 on the F note. You get the 13-inch snare and floor tom versus the 12-inch snare and floor tom on the F Note 5. But on the downside, if you compare this against the F Note 5, that drum set has a splash cymbal, it has the better hi-hats, and it also has the better drum module. So it feels more balanced and more complete versus the ATV drum set. For me personally though, because I'm 6.5 feet tall, I make the F Note drum set look a little bit on the small side. So I would still go with the ATV drum set without the module, and then substitute like some sort of roll-in module I found off eBay. Okay, so that about wraps it up for me. I've spent way too much time working on this video. I hope you found it useful. If you want to pick up any of the electronic drums I just talked about, go use my link to EdrumCenter.com in the description below and save yourself some money. Or if you want to see your name at the end of videos and see them before anybody else, go check out 65 Drums over on Patreon.com. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate you guys. See you in a few.